and the costs of it are very palpable to all of us. We are nonetheless very, very happy to have Jennifer Nash join us for the 7th in our series of distinguished lectures commemorating 40 years of CWDS. Jennifer C. Nash is the Jean Fox Obard Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University. She earned her PhD in African American Studies at Harvard and also has a graduate degree in law from Harvard Law School. She's the author of 3 books: The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography, which was awarded the Alan Bray Memorial Book Prize by the GLQ caucus of the Modern Language Association. Black Feminism Reimagined was also awarded a prize, the Gloria Anzaldúa Book Prize by the National Women's Studies Association, and also Birthing Black Mothers. She's also the editor of Gender Love, is now working on a new book project entitled How We Write Now, Living with Black Feminist Theory. She's currently co-editing the Routledge Companion on Intersectionality. Her research has been supported by the ACLS Burkhardt Fellowship, the Radcliffe Institute, and the Woodrow Wilson Junior Faculty Career Enhancement Fellowship. I now ask Jennifer to present her talk for today. The usual, many of you are familiar with this. Jennifer can speak for up to an hour. We then have Q&A. Either you can unmute yourselves and ask directly, or use the chat box that is available to post your question, and we will read it out and share it with Jennifer. I would request everyone to mute themselves, and if also just in the interest of bandwidth, since the numbers are very high, we've reached our upper limit. Also, to put off your videos just to ensure maximum, bandwidth for communication. Jennifer, over to you now.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's early in the morning here, and there are very few things that could get me dressed and thinking so early in the morning, but an invitation from Mary is one of them. Thank you all, especially for being willing to make the time to listen to my talk on intersectionality, given the conditions of the present there. All of us here have been watching with horror what's happening in India, and so yeah, our thoughts are with you. So my talk for today is drawn from my second book project, which, as Mary mentioned, was called Black Feminism Reimagined. As with all books, my thinking has continued to evolve and move since this was published, so I look forward to the Q&A. I'm particularly interested both in questions around the institutionalization of academic feminism and how intersectionality is a part of that story, and interested in questions around the global travel of intersectionality. So I hope we can talk about both of those and more in the Q&A. So what I plan to do in my talk today is to offer sort of a brief overview of what the book project was about, and then spend some time talking about what I've called the intersectionality wars and how they're waged, at least in the context of the US Academy. So in an article published in the New Yorker magazine in 2016, journalist Nathan Heller described intersectionality as the heart of contemporary student activism. He writes, and I quote, "If the new campus activism has a central paradigm, it is intersectionality, a theory originating in Black feminism that sees identity-based oppression operating in cross-hatching ways." A year later, journalist Andrew Sullivan published a polemic against intersectionality in New York magazine. He described intersectionality as, in his words, the latest academic craze sweeping the American academy, and he likened intersectionality to a religion, one that, as he says, quote, produces a dangerous orthodoxy through which all of human experience is explained and through which all speech must be filtered. Both articles were largely condemned for representing students as hypersensitive and coddled, and for trafficking in deep misunderstandings of intersectionality's histories, critical aspirations, and roots in Black feminist theory. Yet what interests me about the articles and the vociferous responses to them by scholars and activists on the US left is how intersectionality acted as the window through which to view either the imagined problems or the imagined progress of the contemporary university. In some ways, it is unsurprising that a term rooted in Black women's intellectual production would be figured as a dangerous space of political excess, as an ideology that has colonized the hearts and minds of college students, as this is precisely how Black women's corporeal presences have been figured. Yet what is new, and in my mind surprising, is the contention that intersectionality is at the center of the university's intellectual and political life, that an understanding of the university requires contending with intersectionality. Black Feminism Reimagined, my second book, is a project that carefully studies intersectionality's lives in the US university. The project was born from a deep curiosity about the variety of political and theoretical work that intersectionality is called upon to perform, and in the peculiarly contentious battles that have been waged around intersectionality, battles which I argue implicate the body that haunts the analytic, Black women, even if she is not always explicitly named. If intersectionality functions as a barometer measuring and calibrating the political atmosphere of the US university, I argue that it has been most emphatically called upon to perform corrective ecological work in the context of women's studies. And I should drop a footnote and say the US university has been marked by endless name changing in the field of women's studies, from women's studies to gender and sexuality studies. So in the context of this talk, I'm going to use the name women's studies as a placeholder for these varied projects, and we can talk more about name changes in the Q&A. And I argue that it is in relationship to academic feminism that intersectionality's institutional life has taken shape. Indeed, in Black Feminism Reimagined, I treat intersectionality as women's studies' primary program building initiative, as its institutional orientation, even as the field retains an ambivalent relationship with the analytic, always imagining it as simultaneously promising and dangerous, the field's utopian future, and its past tense. More than that, because women's studies has been a kind of laboratory for intersectionality's institutional life in the US Academy, understanding feminist conversations about intersectionality as the remedy, the cure, the threat, or the peril enables an understanding of the debates that swirl around intersectionality in the university at large. In the book, I explore what it has meant for Black feminism and Black feminists to have intersectionality come to occupy the center of women's studies and to migrate across disciplinary boundaries, to be both filled with promise and emptied of specific meaning. I ask how Black feminists have made visible their collective feelings about intersectionality's citational ubiquity in and beyond women's studies. And I probe the Black feminist affects that attend to the hopes and perils that have been tethered to the analytic. So part of the work of the book is to argue that there is a single affect that has come to mark contemporary academic Black feminist practice, which I call defensiveness. So I want to talk briefly about that before jumping into the bulk of the talk for today. So let me illustrate defensiveness through a story. And part of this involves like time travel and imagining when we were all in rooms together in academic conferences. But if you can imagine that for a moment, I'm part of a panel at a small conference with a few other Black feminist scholars, all of whom work on intersectionality. The mood is tense as we discuss the racial politics of intersectionality's circulation, its movement across the humanities and social sciences, and its status as women's studies signature analytic. One scholar remarks that intersectionality's ubiquity reminds her of a passage from a canonical book by Ntozake Shange, a collection of poems called For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. And that quote is, "Somebody almost walked off with all of my stuff." The audience roars in delight, and I find myself fascinated both by the deployment of Shange's provocative image of theft and by the audience's enthusiasm. This book was born of questions that emerged that day. Why had the idea of intersectionality as something stolen resonated so deeply? How might we understand?
I don't want to interrupt you. Could you be a little slower and a little louder?
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
Let me actually move my
Sorry
computer.
to interrupt you.
No, let me move my computer closer. I'm trying to balance all of this on my desk. Sure. Tell me if the, and by the way, Mary, tell me if the volume is better. I'm also going to just turn up my speaker on my side. Okay. How might we understand the racial politics of this scene? One where a canonical Black feminist work is used to theorize the violent theft of another canonical Black feminist work. Who owns intersectionality and who steals it? What might this encounter reveal to us about the feelings of contemporary academic US Black feminism? I treat this scene as a point of departure to capture what I argue is a distinctively contemporary academic Black feminist affect, defensiveness. I treat defensiveness as manifested most explicitly through Black feminism's proprietary attachments to intersectionality. These attachments conscript Black feminism into a largely protective posture, leaving Black feminists mired in policing intersectionality's usages, demanding that intersectionality remain located within Black feminism, and reasserting intersectionality's true origins, true in quotes, in Black feminist texts. My book traces how defensiveness is largely articulated by rendering intersectionality Black feminist property, terrain that has been gentrified, colonized, and appropriated, and as territory that must be guarded and protected through vigilance, care, and stewardship. In treating defensiveness as a defining Black feminist feeling, my intention is not to diagnose individual Black feminists as defensive or to pathologize Black feminist feelings, nor is my impulse to ignore histories of anti-Blackness and misogyny that render Black feminist defensiveness a political response to ongoing violence. I seek to attend to that history, even as I critique the proprietary impulses of Black feminism in an effort to reveal how the defensive posture traps Black feminism, hindering its visionary world-making capacities. The book then theorizes defensiveness as the feeling that emerges when intersectionality is thought to be a lost object, or worse, a stolen object. It is also a book that seeks to encourage and imagine other ways of feeling Black feminist, other ways of being Black feminist, and doing Black feminist labor in the academy that eschew defensiveness and its toxicity. So the bulk of my talk today is about the institutional life of intersectionality, and my route into thinking through those questions is going to be spending some time with the figure of the critic, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes. Quick sip of water and then I'll continue. I discovered something about myself when reading a recently published edited volume. I am, in the words of the volume's editor, a vocal critic of intersectionality. To be hailed as one of intersectionality's critics is to inhabit deeply uncomfortable terrain. Jasbir Puar notes, and I quote her, that the claim to intersectionality as the dominant feminist method can be produced with such insistence that an interest in exploring other frames gets rendered as problematic, and even produces women of color feminists invested in other genealogies as race traders. My impulse then was to understand vocal critic as much more than an intellectual critique. I felt it as an allegation, challenging my political commitments to the project of Black feminism. My desire was to defend myself from these charges, to insist that I admire intersectionality, that my work aspires to be generative and not destructive. My talk for today aspires to suspend that critical desire, even as I am deeply intrigued by it. What are the intellectual and political conditions that permitted me to understand the word critic as an allegation? Why has the term critic, in the context of scholarly debate about intersectionality, taken on such a powerful charge? Rather than resist the term or refuse its interpolation, in this talk, I follow the word critic around the Black feminist theoretical archive, endeavoring to carefully trace to whom it attaches and what makes that attachment possible. In so doing, this talk asserts that Black feminist theorists emphatically retell a singular story about intersectionality. That intersectionality is the subject of attacks, that it is the victim of an intense backlash. In this account, one group of scholars supports intersectionality, Black feminists, and another opposes it, the critics. This is a deeply compelling narrative. It has a victim, intersectionality, and a villain, the critic. And it has a moral imperative. Intersectionality must be saved, and Black feminists must defend intersectionality. Yet, as I argue in this talk, this narrative is the site of various projections and fantasies. A close engagement with Black feminist citational practices reveals that intersectionality's critic is actually imaginatively produced by Black feminists as they are locked into practices of keeping intersectionality close or holding it as property. In treating the critic as an imaginative projection, I am careful not to argue that Black feminists are engaged in dreaming up something that is not there. Instead, I consider how women's studies positioning of Black feminists as disciplinarians who demand that the field offer an account of Black women actually gets performed by Black feminists ourselves as we contend with intersectionality's movement to the field center. The constant invocation of the malicious critic as a pernicious outsider becomes a crucial strategy through which Black feminists reassert their territorial claim to intersectionality and perform their collective desire to shield intersectionality from criticism. In the first section of my talk, I spent some time engaging what I call the intersectionality wars, arguing that the prevailing story I have traced here is the centerpiece of those wars. So again, a story. At the 2014 American Studies Association conference, there was a panel called Kill This Keyword. The panel asked scholars to sort of run like a game show to choose terms that circulate a lot, say neoliberal or sovereignty, and to determine if those words actually still have meaning for us or if they've become so overused as to be emptied of any meaning. Nothing generated more anxiety than intersectionality, which was immediately declared dead. Moments after a collective performance of intersectional fatigue, one scholar voiced discomfort with killing intersectionality because to do that, he said, would be to kill Black feminism, or perhaps even to kill Black women as objects of study. The room grew quiet at the prospect of symbolically killed Black women. And as intersectionality slipped into Black feminism, slipped into Black women, the analytic moved from dangerous to desirable, and the audience that had been quick to kill had been convinced to rescue. I use the term intersectionality wars to describe the battles staged in this scene. Indeed, debates about intersectionality all too quickly become debates on whether scholars are for or against intersectionality, which all too often become debates about whether one is for or against Black feminism. These slippages between Black women and Black feminism, between intersectionality and Black women, animate the intersectionality wars because they ensure that discussing intersectionality's critical limits is always already to debate one's racial politics and allegiances. Undergirding this moment at this conference and the intersectionality wars more broadly are the affective dimensions of the narrative I described earlier, one where intersectionality is under siege and must be saved. I personally am drawn to the term intersectionality wars because of its echo with feminism's other wars, particularly the sex wars. If the sex wars, at least in the context of the US in the 1970s and 1980s, were rooted in the sexual culture and sexual panics of that era, the intersectionality wars that I trace in my book are relatively recent battles, rooted in intersectionality's movement across disciplinary borders, across administrative intellectual boundaries, and across academic popular boundaries. And I should say, at least in the context of the US, one of the things that makes intersectionality so distinctive is that it has a public life that no other term in feminism has had, right? So intersectionality is talked about in mainstream media, on social media, even as it's talked about in ways that might feel quite distinct from how I talk about it in my book, or the citational trails that feel important to me. It is also the case that intersectionality in the context of the U has a life in the administrative arms of the university. So as our universities increasingly rhetorically gesture towards diversity and equity, they will often do this through talking about their commitments to intersectionality. Again, they're often using that term in a way that feels unfamiliar to me, or quite distinct from how we might use it in the context of the feminist classroom. So there are these kind of fascinating travels of the term that, as I argue in my book, generate particular kinds of anxieties for Black feminists who find intersectionality moving in the world in ways that feel unfamiliar or even strange. So I date the intersectionality wars to intersectionality's institutionalization, to the rise of Kimberly Crenshaw's articles mapping the margins and demarginalizing the intersection of race and sex to near canonical status. And I date it to intersectionality's circulation in popular feminist conversations as a way of signaling a critical practice attentive to difference, and as a way of disciplining what in the States has become a dirty word, so-called white feminism and white feminists, and as a strategy for naming a form of feminism that is increasingly considered the only ethical form of feminism. As more scholars have laid claim to intersectionality, as more disciplines have come to rhetorically value intersectionality, the intersectionality wars have escalated, with Black feminists increasingly stepping into the fray to defend the analytic from imagined misuse and abuse. So if the intersectionality wars are contentious, what precisely is being fought over? And so I want to lay out three ways that these battles unfold. The first of which is around origin stories, the second around appropriation, and the third around the figure of the critic. So I'll say a little bit about origin stories and appropriation and more about the critic. So origin stories. The intersectionality wars are often waged over competing origin stories that narrate the genesis of intersectionality. When I describe origin stories, I capture how Black feminism often tethers intersectionality to a coherent, legible, and singular moment of origin, describing the moment in which intersectionality was born. Origin stories work by presuming that intersectionality emerged through a singular voice, historical moment, or foundational text. In this way, origin stories are distinct from intellectual genealogies that trace how concepts emerge from multiple traditions, or that analyze how differing theoretical traditions might treat the same concept differently. Intersectionality's origin stories circulate in at least two ways. First, they respond to women's studies' whitening of intersectionality, and whitening is Sirma Bilger's term, by centering the analytic's origins in Black feminist studies. They often insist on intersectionality's presence in Black feminist theory well before the term was coined, or they emphasize intersectionality's long roots in Black feminist scholarship. Quote, refers not to the race of intersectionality practitioners, but to the ways of doing intersectionality that re-articulate it around Eurocentric epistemologies. One of the central ways that this whitening unfolds, according to Bilger, is through the claim that intersectionality was in the air, that it was nascent in women's studies before it was named. This proprietary feminist claim to the analytic ignores, and here again I quote Bilger, the historical fact that intersectionality was developed by Black women activists and intellectuals against white-dominated feminism, as much as against the male-dominated Black liberation movement, against capitalism and heterosexism. The Black feminist response to the so-called whitening of intersectionality is to assert, as Jean Alt-Belkir does, that intersectionality is, quote, one of the greatest gifts of Black women's studies to social theory as a whole. In Belkir's account, intersectionality is not only a product of Black feminist theory, but also an indication of Black feminist generosity. Intersectionality, in her words, is a gift. Purposes, what is so fascinating about the response to women's studies proprietary claims to then becomes who truly owns intersectionality, who gets to claim the term as intellectual property. While origin stories are a strategy for countering women's studies narratives about the analytic, they often produce their own sets of debates. Black feminists regularly debate the question, who invented the term intersectionality? And I should say, within Black feminism, origin stories are often amplified in disciplinarily specific ways. Black feminist social scientists, for example, regularly perform their origin stories through sociologist Patricia Hill Collins's work on the matrix of domination, while Black feminist humanists often rely on Crenshaw and her work on intersectionality as the moment where the term was born. Still, other Black feminist scholars perform their origin stories through engagement with the long history of intersectionality, emphasizing figures like the Combahee River Collective, Deborah King, Frances Beale, or Anna Julia Cooper. Oftentimes, these appeals to earlier Black feminist scholarship seek to locate intersectionality's arrival in a moment that long predated the arrival of anti-essentialist feminism, or they complicate the narrative that anti-essentialist feminism only arrived in the 1970s. Even as these debates unfold in disciplinarily specific ways, it is crucial to note that Kimberly Crenshaw's work has remained a touchstone. Legal scholar Devin Carbotto notes that Crenshaw's Demarginalizing the Intersections of Race and Sex article, in his words, quote, introduced what would become the most enormously influential social theory, intersectionality. I note this to emphasize that a substantial part of the labor of Black feminist origin stories is to center Crenshaw, to insist on her fundamental centrality to intersectionality's intellectual genealogies, and to emphasize her role as creator of this analytic. I should also note that other Black feminist scholars challenge this history. Patricia Hill Collins, for example, upends what she calls the stock story about intersectionality that emphasizes Crenshaw. And in one conference, Patricia Hill Collins said that so often we think of, quote, Kimberly Crenshaw as Christopher Columbus. She came back from the native lands from far, far away with the gift of intersectionality. Wow, she brought us a present. For Collins, prevailing narratives of intersectionality's origins in Crenshaw's work obscure the analytic's true birthplace in social movements and activism. In their collaborative work on intersectionality, Patricia Hill Collins and Sirma Bilge emphasize that intersectionality has undergirded Black feminist practice for generations. According to this story, intersectionality was present in Black feminist work and then moved into the university, not the reverse. I want to say a little bit about the language of appropriation and then talk about the critic. So undergirding the debate about intersectionality's origins is a broader claim that intersectionality has been taken over or colonized by women's studies, or perhaps more precisely, by white women's studies. Black feminist scholars regularly mobilize language like gentrification, appropriation, commodification, and colonization to describe how intersectionality moves in troubling ways. And in fact, the intersectionality wars are often waged through attempts to highlight intersectionality's appropriations. If intersectionality has been taken, or perhaps stolen, then the task of Black feminism is to expose the theft and to reclaim proper ownership of the analytic. Nicole Alexander Floyd, for example, writes, barely a decade into the new millennium, a new wave of raced, gendered, occultic commodification is afoot. This is focused on the concept of intersectionality. If intersectionality has been commodified, it is to suggest that the analytic, the result of intellectual labor, has been imbued with value and that it has been rendered a product for sale or for theft in the marketplace of ideas. While commodification is one rhetorical device through which defensiveness is ethically mobilized, colonization is another. The language of colonization positions intersectionality as a territory that has been wrongfully and violently taken by outsiders. Sima Bilger, for example, notes, quote, intersectionality originally focused on transformative knowledge production and radical politics of social justice has been commodified and colonized for neoliberal regimes. Here, Bilger is involved in an origin story. She tells us what intersectionality once was, and also a story about wrongful possession, a story about theft, about outsiders taking intersectionality. In this act of colonization, intersectionality paradoxically allows scholars who are not actually invested in intersectional work to disguise their work in the guise of intersectionality, all the while maintaining the status quo. The language of appropriation, however, leaves two central questions unanswered. First, it is unclear how appropriation is different from the movement and migration of theories. Intellectual ideas circulate. Of course, their circulation is made possible by structures that confer value on some concepts and devalue others, by the institutional and geographic contexts in which ideas emerge. But we do not know yet how to distinguish appropriation from the variety of uses to which any theory will be put by scholars of differing theoretical and political traditions. And second, where this scholarship succeeds is in its rigorous display that the capacity to call one's work intersectional is a claim to value. Hence, the way that scholars who perform all kinds of work now use the term intersectionality to describe it. However, Black feminists have yet to clearly reveal and then dismantle the system of value that aligns intersectional with good feminist work, that presumes that intersectional scholarship is politically virtuous. Instead, Black feminists have reinvested in intersectionality's value by attempting to limit who can rightfully access the analytic. And lastly, I want to talk a bit about the figure of the critic. So the remainder of my talk turns to the figure of the critic, who is represented as both ubiquitous and destructive, relentlessly attacking intersectionality in precisely the moment that intersectionality has achieved success and visibility. The critic, according to Black feminist scholarship, is marked by what Vivian May calls a cavalier treatment of intersectionality, and by the production of work that is, again, quoting May, damaging to feminist anti-subordination scholarship and activism. As Vivian May writes, and I quote, intersectionality critiques have become something of their own genre, a form so flourishing. At times, it seems critique has become the primary means of taking up the concept and its literatures. Rather than posing questions about intersectionality and its limits, the critic's queries are often imagined to be motivated by an unrelenting willingness to yield to the demands of the university, particularly the demand that we produce work that is new. Critique is not only imagined to be oppositional to intersectionality, but also to the project of Black feminism. While Black feminists have carefully pointed out the ubiquity of critiques, this is May's claim that there's more critiques of intersectionality than work on intersectionality, there has been considerably less care in naming the critics who supposedly proffer and circulate these critiques. For example, in a lengthy article in a special issue of Signs on intersectionality, Barbara Tomlinson diagnoses the work of the critic, and she writes, critics may argue that intersectionality should be set free from the identities of the marginalized women of color who originated it. Critics may claim that intersectionality has not yet revealed as much as it ought to about identity. Or critics may claim that intersectionality has not examined the most important identities, enough identities, too many identities, or identities in a complex enough way. I linger in two moments in Tomlinson's description of the critic's varied labor. First, the ubiquity of the term critics. Critics are monolithic. All critics perform the same intellectual work, and this work undermines intersectionality's anti-subordination efforts. And second, the critic remains unnamed. It is wholly unclear who they are. Despite the contention that the critic is ubiquitous, that intersectionality is under siege, multiple Black feminist texts, including Tomlinson's, share a lack of specificity about the figure of the critic, as each presumes the critic's omnipresence, yet refuses to name them. There is, though, one critic who is named repeatedly in Black feminist scholarship that guards intersectionality, and that is Jasbir Puar. Puar is often figured in both scholarly and popular work as the paradigmatic critic of intersectionality. And indeed, Patrick Granka, who's a social psychologist, opens his new volume on intersectionality by calling Puar, and I quote, intersectionality's most committed critic. So I attend to scholars' preoccupation with Puar as a critic, not to rescue her from this label, but to interrogate what it means that her work has come to stand for a set of practices that undermine intersectionality, and also to explore what it means that the critic is imagined to be everywhere, and yet the only critic regularly cited is Puar. While some insist that attention is given to Puar because she has offered, in Amy Branzel's words, one of the most thorough critiques of intersectionality, my provocations here are designed to ask about the institutional politics that have made it such that Puar's work, and perhaps even Puar's body, stands for a critique of intersectionality and Black feminism. Puar's status in the literature on intersectionality as the critic is particularly surprising because of her own uneasiness surrounding intersectionality and her desire to think anew about relationality in ways that intersectionality may or may not be able to accommodate. Indeed, it is crucial to read Puar's engagement with intersectionality twice. First, in her monograph, Terrorist Assemblages, and then later in her essay, I Would Rather Be a Cyborg Than a Goddess. Her monograph, Terrorist Assemblages, ends by setting the concept of assemblage, which she champions, against intersectionality. Puar writes, and I quote, as opposed to an intersectional model of identity, which presumes that components, race, class, gender, sexuality, nation, age, and religion are separable and can thus be disassembled, an assemblage is more attuned to interwoven forces that merge and dissipate time, space, and body against linearity, coherency, and permanency. And she continues, as a tool of diversity management and a mantra of liberal multiculturalism, intersectionality colludes with the disciplinary apparatus of the state, census, demography, racial profiling, surveillance, insofar as difference is encased within a structural container that simply wishes the messiness of identity into a formulaic grid. And yet a few years later, in her paper, I Would Rather Be a Cyborg Than a Goddess, Puar traces something that we might think of as ambivalence about intersectionality, and particularly how it has come to be deployed in the space of academic feminism. She writes, quote, "What the method of intersectionality is most predominantly used to qualify is the specific difference of women of color, a category that has now become, I would argue, simultaneously emptied of specific meaning on the one hand and overdetermined in its deployment on the other. In this usage, intersectionality always produces an other, and that other is always a woman of color who must invariably be shown to be resistant, subversive, or articulating a grievance." The critical questions Puar poses about intersectionality and its usages center on its dominance in women's studies, its place as the field's prevailing method, and the fact that to pose questions about intersectionality results in precisely what has happened to Puar, the placement of the theorist and her frameworks as traitorous. Here, what Puar performs is a critical inquiry surrounding intersectionality's circulation and institutionalization. Why then are her ambivalent engagements with intersectionality's politics forgotten in the service of representing her work exclusively as a damning critique? How can we make sense of how a scholar's ideas change, shift, and transform over the course of a life spent thinking? In other words, how can we track the evolution or shift of Puar's work on intersectionality from her book to her article, with a deep recognition of the fact that our collective scholarly endeavors are rooted in larger disciplinary conversations that might result in different presentations in our ideas? While my endeavor here can only be speculative, I think it is worth noting, or emphasizing even, that one of intersectionality's only named critics, and the analytic's imagined preeminent critic, is not Black, and is often positioned as a non-Black feminist, an anti-Black feminist, and at times as a queer theorist rather than a feminist. My consideration of Puar's status as an outsider to Black feminism unfolds alongside how my own work gets described as critique. Our respective critical projects are described differently and received differently in the field. While some of my earlier work, particularly my article, Rethinking Intersectionality, gets described as critique, it is also largely understood as emerging in and through an affection for Black feminism, a fact that might be tethered to my own scholarly work, but that might also be tethered to the ongoing collapses between racially marked subjects' bodies and their objects of study. When, for example, Brittany Cooper describes my work, she situates it as a Black feminist critique of intersectionality, one that emerges from inside the imagined location where intersectionality was born. My location as a Black feminist and as a Black woman means that my critiques of intersectionality are imagined as practices of love and affection rather than hostility, and are thus treated with a kind of generosity. If Puar's critiques are imagined to emerge from outside of Black feminism, she is also often positioned as an outsider to feminism itself, with her roots in queer theory underscored. Lynn Huffer, for example, notes that Jasbir Puar, quote, shifts her focus away from feminist intersectionality to queer assemblage. And so it's interesting how intersectionality gets tethered to feminism and assemblage to queer theory, and the two, feminist theory and queer theory, as distinct traditions and maybe even traditions in conflict. Rather than reify an imagined distinction between feminist theory and queer theory, I ask how Puar's imagined location within queer theory, or even outside of feminist theory, amplifies the conception of her critique as formed by an outsider, and thus a critique that renders intersectionality particularly vulnerable. In revealing that the critic is rarely named, and that when she is so often only Jasbir Puar, I seek to suggest that Black feminists produce the critic rather than expose the critic. Indeed, while the critic is regularly described by Black feminists as an omnipresent threat, she is actually one scholar who is relentlessly cast as an outsider to intersectionality and to Black feminist theory, a framing of her work that requires a refusal to engage her scholarship on intersectionality's institutional locations and racial politics. So I want to offer some concluding thoughts before we open it up for Q&A. This talk began with my anxieties about being hailed as a critic. It has unfolded as a rumination on the figure of the critic, an imaginative villainous projection, who I argue is central to the intersectionality wars, and thus animates the defensive territoriality that underpins so much of Black feminist practice. The critic is figured as the outsider, the hostile stranger who seeks to encroach on territory, on property, on hard-earned intellectual turf that is not hers. But why would the practice of constructing the critic be so appealing to Black feminists? Part of my contention is that the figure of the critic locks Black feminism into the logic of what Alison Pipemeier terms besiegement. Following Pipemeier's work, I ask how the figure of the critic and the narratives of besiegement it can produce can be so alluring, particularly when the critic is imagined as a figure outside of our boundaries. The image of a vulnerable intersectionality, a literal space that needs to be protected from colonizers, positions Black feminism as not only an intellectual and political tradition, but also an ethical intervention that speaks on behalf of Black women in the service of protecting our intellectual labor. There is then nothing more virtuous than protecting intersectionality from the critic. Yet this same alluring narrative locks Black feminism into a problematic location in women's studies, one that makes us primarily oriented toward protecting our own turf. Indeed, the kind of paranoid readings advanced by Black feminist practitioners invested in exposing the critic play out in the context of a field that continues to offer Black feminist theory an incredibly limited role in the intellectual and political project of the field. Black feminism is still thought to be primarily a corrective to a white feminist tradition. If the tradition is designed merely to correct, rather than to exist as its own vibrant field of debate, then it is logical that Black feminists find themselves mired in the impasse of the present. I enter this debate not merely as a scholar invested in Black feminist theory, but as one whose name gets included on the list of critics. This talk then has, for me, prompted a desire not to upend the category of the critic, but to spend some time with the villain in Black feminism's prevailing narrative, and to ask, what is it that the critic might offer, and how might Black feminists cultivate the critic, effectively seeing what she offers not as a threatening gesture, but as a kind of love letter, one that, in Lauren Berlant's words, offers us a chance to imagine becoming different. Part of the critic's offering is a rigorous engagement with the psychic structure of our tradition, a structure that has empowered us to locate danger everywhere. The critic also offers us a chance to refuse the lure of territoriality, a form of imagined agency that always brings us to an impasse rather than liberating us from the destructive intersectionality wars. Part of this offering is also compelling a critical attention to how we, Black feminists, construct who is inside and outside the boundaries of our project, and to interrogate how our anti-captivity project has become its own boundary policing exercise. Ultimately, what the critic sends us is not a threatening world-ending message, but an invitation to embrace the possibility of other ways to be and feel Black feminist. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. And apologies for interrupting you, but I think it was for the best in the sense that I think we could hear you so much better. Wonderful thoughts here. I think drawing from your book, but also going beyond the book itself, and laying out for us I mean, for someone like, say, even for myself, who has dipped into and been inspired by intersectionality as a notion. I've written about it briefly. At the same time, also a bit bewildered, I will say, bewildered by, given my location here in India, bewildered by, the term wasn't with me then, the intersectionality wars that you talk about. And the largely, and the largely painful, I will say, you mentioned the word affect, largely painful nature of those wars, because what one is hearing from what you're saying is pain on all sides, pain on the part of those who want to defend the territory, and pain on the part of a critic like yourself, being marked and named in the way that you are, being seen as not someone who wishes well and wishes to see intersectionality flourish. So I don't want to sort of hog more time here, but I now open it up for questions, for comments from anyone. The best way to do this would be to actually write your questions, since there are so many of you. Identifying you might be a little difficult. But if you have a quick question that you want to ask, please just unmute yourself and say who you are. That would help when there's 100 of you there. Say who you are and speak your question. Otherwise, type it into the chat box. Geeta, please go ahead.
Okay, I was going to wait, but since no
just name yourself, Geeta, if you don't mind,
sure,
because
sure. Yeah. My name's Geeta Sen, and thank you for a great and very thought-provoking lecture. I was going to wait, but then no one was stepping in, so I thought I may as well come in. It provoked a lot of thinking, not just about the defensiveness within the Black feminist community that you spoke about, but that in a sense, I could see the defensiveness in so many other such communities as well, operating differently, but then the same territoriality, the same insider-outsider syndromes, the same critique by ad hominem rather than engagement with the ideas of the critic. And I wonder if you would agree that part of what is going on is the displacement of the very real discrimination and marginalization of Black feminist scholarship and scholars onto this idea that this is now ours, this idea came from us. So it's a displacement of what is the reality of marginalization and subordination within the academy onto the terrain of ideas as a war over ideas, and to whom do these ideas belong? And I wonder if you would agree with that, or what you might say to that.
Thank you, Geeta, for that question. Yes, I think I agree with you. I think I would add caveats or something like that, right? I think I would say a few things. I think that, first of all, intersectionality holds a set of desires, political desires, or aspires to hold those desires, or we come to intersectionality with these desires that have an intensity that I think is unmatched in other terms. And perhaps, and I sort of gestured to this in the talk, and I saw a question about this in the chat, some of this has to do with the fact that intersectionality is distinct in its public and academic life, right? There are desires that come to it in the public sphere, and there are desires that come to it in the academic sphere. I also think that intersectionality becomes particularly fraught because, as you said, there are people who have labored for academic feminism to have institutional legitimacy, right? And in the context of the US Academy, it has become a kind of tradition for Black feminists in talks and in books to name the Black women who have made this field and who have died so young, right? To name them as evidence of what the university extracts from Black bodies and from Black women's bodies in particular. And yet that leaves us in this curious place, right? Where Black feminists both want institutional legitimacy and visibility, right? Like if people labored for intersectionality to have validity and legibility, then why do we feel so much anxiety when our provost uses the word, right? Like, wasn't legibility and visibility the thing we wanted? So there's this desire for visibility and legibility and recognition, and this desire to say, but wait, I want this term to circulate only in the ways I want it to circulate. So there's a kind of, and I see that complex dance as about the complicated relationship that Black feminism and maybe other forms of minoritarian knowledge have to claiming the power that we've accrued, right? So in the context of the US academic feminism, even at a place like Duke where I teach, where we are incredibly well resourced, we will start every meeting by talking about how precarious we are. And I think to myself, we are no longer precarious. We actually wield an extraordinary amount of power. It is not equivalent to the power that the physics department wields. It is not equivalent to the power that the history department wields, but we are not without power. And so what happens if we actually start by recognizing the power that we've accrued, that we now feel a certain amount of ambivalence towards, because we feel that feminists should not have power or should wield it differently, right? We have this power, so how are we going to actually wield it in ways that feel true to the ethical principles and political projects that started the work of academic feminism? All this to say, I think you're right that this is about displacement, but I think it's also about this ambivalence that feminists generally and Black feminists particularly feel about power and feel about our relationship to institutionality, right? Mary, you mentioned this series of lectures celebrating the 40th anniversary, right? And I think of how many anniversary projects I've been to at different institutions where there's both tremendous excitement about the labor of building something, which is a tremendous amount of labor, and also a certain anxiety about what it means to be housed in a university, right? That now, at least in the context of universities where I've worked, wants us to look and speak in a particular way that may or may not be how we want to look and speak. And so I think so much of the battles that swirl around intersectionality are about that. And then the last piece, which might be a US particular piece, is about the logics of diversity and how it's worked in the US university. So particularly in the moment in 2020, when COVID came to the US and coincided with the murder of George Floyd, and we were all home watching it on our TV screens, there was this sort of push to think about how every institution could respond to racism and anti-Blackness, right? It was as if our institutions discovered racism. They were like, it's out there, oh my God, right? And so much of the work that's happened in the last year that our institutions have engaged in, my own institution is now doing a reckoning with its history of racism, right? Because again, it just discovered that there is a history that it must reckon with. And so much of that reckoning has taken the form of our universities turning to us, women's studies, but also Black feminism and Black women writers, and saying, like, tell us, talk to us about the histories of anti-Blackness that you've documented. And we feel some ambivalence about this as well, right? And rightfully so. Racism didn't start in 2020. It's embarrassing that our universities have only come to reckon with this now. I mean, there's so much to feel ambivalence towards, But it's also a really interesting moment that may pass where our universities seek our knowledge, right? And are asking us to shape the direction of their agendas around race and equity and justice. And I think there's a complicated relationship between intersectionality as an anti-subordination project and diversity as a project that, as Chandra Mohanty says, is about benign variation, right? Drop a few bodies in and keep the institution the same. There's a real conflict there that I think remains a source of tremendous anxiety for Black feminists. So thank you for your question, Geeta. I appreciate it.
There's a question in the chat box. Oh my, there's more now, there are plenty. There's one from Rajni Palriwala. Can you see that? I want to pursue the idea of appropriation more than that of critic. Appropriation can be double-edged. It can empty an analytic of its cutting edge, but in traveling may lead to a wider acknowledgement of the politics that the analytic carries. With intersectionality, we see this a mere listing of differences, an assertion of one dimension as the one real oppression, or an acknowledgement that we have to deal with the differences and bring them together. So this is a comment on the work of appropriation and on traveling. Rajni, do you want to add to that? Because it's coming across more as a comment.
Okay, well, it is actually a question, even though I didn't put the question mark at the end of the sentence. It is a question. And it relates to what often over here seems to be there have been the intersectionality debates here on two of the counts which you mentioned. One, where people say that actually we don't need to turn to American Black feminist theory for it, because it has been, like Patricia Hill Collins says, part of social movements. It's been part of social movements here. And as different movements emerged, they pushed each other into articulating it in different ways. But one of the wars which we've had here is this fear, what has come from women's studies or gender studies is being used everywhere. And it's true that it then gets emptied of meaning very often. But I keep wondering about that this appropriation, should we only be worried about the emptying of meaning? Or can we find ways in which the spread of the term actually could be carrying the politics further of both the critique of that analytic and the critique and the politics of the critics, which both really together enable the politics of that analytic and the travel of that analytic?
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate the question. I'm going to take a stab at it, and if it doesn't answer it fully, please ask again. Part of what I find so interesting about the language of appropriation is that it presumes a singular and fixed meaning of intersectionality, right? In the longer version of this project, one of the things I talk about is this Black feminist preoccupation with returning to original texts and reading them faithfully. So there's increasingly this sense that if you really just took your time and studied Crenshaw and read it very closely, then you would understand its intrinsic meaning. And in my book, I liken this both to the conservative politics of the US Supreme Court, where you're just supposed to stay faithful to the word. But there's also something about this that's like, it treats intersectionality as like religious doctrine, right? Like if you just pore over the word, you can find its true meaning. Which I'm very curious about this notion of a desire to presume that intersectionality is fixed, right? Because even when Black feminists point to this constellation of founding texts, there are tremendous differences among those founding texts in terms of what they understand the critical possibilities of intersectionality to be, right? So when folks here turn to the Combahee River Collective statement, that is largely a Black feminist, lesbian, Marxist collective that wants to foreground both lesbianism and Marxism as central to a kind of utopian future, right? That's very different than Patricia Hill Collins's idea of a matrix of domination that wants to map how how structures operate to render particular bodies more vulnerable to forms of violence. So I'm always curious about this idea of intersectionality being emptied of meaning, because I actually think when I think about it more, it's not that it's emptied of meaning, it's constantly being filled with different meanings, right? And part of what's so fascinating about intersectionality to me as a term is how capacious it is, right? And so my curiosity is, how much can this term hold, right? And how much can it be asked to hold before it comes to look wholly unfamiliar to me? And I see some of this as a debate among feminists, right? I think of the moments when I've taught intersectionality and I've heard students use the term to describe identity, like they'll describe themselves as like, as an intersectional person. And I always think like, this is a really interesting moment to me, because I actually usually use intersectionality to describe social locations and how certain bodies become closer to vulnerability to violence. I don't use it to describe, say, myself, right? So I'm curious about those moments, but I'm also curious about moments when the term, like I said, comes to be used in ways that feel wholly unfamiliar. So I think there's an interesting way of thinking about the term, not so much as emptied of meaning, but as being asked to hold more and more. And I guess, the last thing, and I sort of mentioned this in relationship to Gita's question, is that I think there's much to be said. I don't say it in my book, but there's much to be said about the relationship between intersectionality and desire, because I think we feminists have wanted so much from this term, and I think have hoped that it is as a term something that will get us out of a variety of sets of political problems that mark the present, right? And I think some of the anxiety that we now see around intersectionality's travels and appropriations is that no term can get us out of the problems that mark the present, right? That no singular term can do that work. That we're going to that, as we feminists know, we're going to have to draw on our toolkits in the plural, right? That no one term can get us out of the problems of the present. What I think intersectionality has promised us, and what has given us, I think, hope and anxiety, we could talk more about this, is it offers us the promise of coalition, right? It offers us the promise that multiply marginalized people who are marginalized in different ways might come together. This is Kathy Cohen's article in GLQ, Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, that perhaps a variety of people who find themselves, quote unquote, on the bottom will say, wait a second, why are we all being shut out of political life? Even as we're being shut out of political life in different ways, let's use intersectionality as a tool to think about our shared oppression, even as that oppression is lived and felt differently. And I think there's a lot of complexity around whether coalition is possible and what makes it possible, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So hopefully that gets at some of your question. Thank you.
Thank you, it did. And of course, it opens up more discussion for another time.
Thank you for that. There's a question in the next question from Swati Kamble. I'll read it out. Thank you for this very enriching talk. As a Dalit woman activist, I have come to embrace intersectionality, and I felt connected with Angie Marie Hancock's claim that intersectionality-like thoughts have existed around the globe, especially in the global South. This generosity of expanding the knowledge communities beyond Black feminists to call all of us, those who engage with intersectionality as an interpretive community, stewards committed to foster this knowledge for all, is very transformative. We do not see people question the intellectual property right of Marxism, Marxist class theorization. Then why do we question Black feminist labor in developing this concept, which is so relevant for transnational solidarities too?
Thank you for that, Swati, and thank you for bringing Angie Marie Hancock's idea of stewardship up. I think stewardship is a really interesting word and concept that Hancock wants to work through with intersectionality. Part of the reason that I think it's so interesting is because it introduces a generational logic to intersectionality, right? I see Hancock is saying we don't hold our own intersectionality. Our job is to care for it and to ensure that in caring for it, future generations can continue to use it and continue to pass it on, right? So it's a kind of interesting way of thinking through the conundrum of property. On your last point, I'm just going to bring it up again. Oh man, let me see if I can find it in the chat. On this last point, we do not see people question the intellectual property right of Marxist class theorization and the like. It's, I think my desire to think about Black feminists' investment in intersectionality as property is in part born from my reading of the Black feminist intellectual tradition as a critique of ideas of ownership. I think of someone like Cheryl Harris's whiteness as property, but I also think of the Black feminist tradition as much more aligned with the Audrey Hancock stewardship idea that you brought up, right? Ideas of collective ownership, ideas of collective kin structures, ideas, right? Like, so I think of Black feminists writing about family, that's not about nuclear family, but about sort of, as Carol Stack says, all of our kin, right? Like really disrupting normative logics of property and ownership and reading property and ownership as technologies of patriarchy and anti-Blackness that we must free ourselves of to imagine a different kind of future. And so my book was actually born from a desire to think about what happens when Black feminists themselves become seduced by the idea of property, by the logic of property as a way of honoring Black feminist sort of foremothers, right? Our intellectual ancestors. And I see this, I don't mention this in this talk, but I've been super interested in how so many Black feminists in the US in the last 5 years have really reclaimed the term intellectual history, right? Like intellectual history, when I was in graduate school, was not a field that was hospitable to women. It was not a field that was hospitable to women of color. It was where you read like Marx, Engels, Hegel, Gramsci, right? Like that was intellectual history. And then we have someone like Brittany Cooper arguing that Black women's thought is intellectual history, and that actually we need to fundamentally lay claim to this term as a way of valuing histories of Black women's intellectual production. I find that really fascinating as an intellectual and as a political move, because it's not dislodging the idea of a category like intellectual history as one that confers value upon certain forms of knowledge. It instead says, we want to use that term too. And that's sort of what I'm trying to push at with property. Like if Black feminism is a tradition about anti-captivity and anti-ownership or otherwise ownership or non-ownership, why is it so important to us to own intersectionality? And I think it's fascinating to me. I mean, in the US context, I will often get asked questions that have a kind of anxious underpinning. Like, do you see how intersectionality is getting used outside of outside of the US? What will that mean for Black women? Right. Right. And so that's also really interesting to me, because my thinking about stewardship in the Hancock sense of the term is, again, that our job is to care for this analytic, and we can talk more about what that means. But to me, care is not about policing or saying it's mine. It's actually, as I argue in the book, the riskier, harder, more upsetting work of being willing to say, maybe the answer is not that intersectionality is mine. Maybe what I actually need to do is to let go of it. And this goes to some of the previous question about appropriation. Maybe what I need to do is to see what happens when intersectionality moves in ways that feel uncomfortable and unfamiliar to me, and rather than hold on to it, see what happens as it moves. So thank you for the question, Swati.
Now there's going to be an avalanche of questions, I think. Bhashwati Thakurta comments on Puar. Puar claims that the relation to the body and matter can produce an event. Also, WOC always creates an other. Would you explain this in the light of Black Lives Matter?
Sure. I'm also going to try to just find that in the chat so I could read it as we go.
Yeah.
Hang on 1 second.
Sorry,
bear with me. The joys of Zoom. Oh, I see it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. I think that part of Puar's effort in terrorist assemblages is to suggest, and I'm going to rehearse this and not, this is not my argument, this is her argument, I think, is that intersectionality produces a kind of, makes identity static, right? That's how she wants to read Crenshaw. And we can, I understand this as how intersectionality often gets articulated in the world as you can break bodies up into these pieces, right? There's race, there's gender, there's class, there's sexuality. And so Puar wants to suggest that this stable, fixed notion of identity actually doesn't capture what how she thinks we move through the world, which is, as she argues in Terrorist Assemblages, through event, motion, movement. Now, my own reading of Crenshaw is different. I think when Crenshaw offers us the first metaphor about intersectionality, which is imagine traffic flowing through an intersection, she tells us a Black woman standing in the intersection could be injured because of race, could be injured because of gender, could be injured because of race and gender coinciding or colliding. And she goes on to tell us that law, the US anti-discrimination law, presumes that if a Black woman is injured because of how race and gender coincide, that actually no injury has happened. And law simply walks away and says, we can't figure this out. To me, that conception of intersectionality is entirely about motion and movement, an event, right? She's interested in the event of the collision. She's interested in how bodies move through intersections. So I'm not compelled by the characterization of intersectionality as sort of inattentive to movement or motion. Puar also says, as mentioned in the comment, that intersectionality always creates this subject who is woman of color, who is always other, and must always be articulating a grievance or must be wounded. And, I mean, my latest book is about the category of Black motherhood and how it has come into view as a wounded identity. Largely in part because of Black Lives Matter, where I became really curious about how Black mothers had a political visibility and currency in this moment that was made possible by loss or injury or trauma. And so, my project started by being really interested in how in 2016, when Hillary Rodham Clinton speaks at the Democratic National Convention, she brings the mothers of the movement with her, Black mothers whose children have been killed by police violence. And they're there to confer credibility on her. And they have a political currency that felt really different to me than previous moments. And that made me really curious about how at least Black mothers in the context of the US come into political view, not so much through otherness, but through trauma, through grief, and through loss. And so, in that sense, I resonate with that portion of Puar's read. I also think, in the context of academic feminism and how the discipline has been sort of codified, at least in the context of the US, it remains the case that the primary narrative that is taught still is that there is this body of thought called feminist theory, and that there are a set of interventions that are largely born from the anger or grief of exclusion. And those interventions that we teach are transnational feminism and Black feminism, which I should also note, and this might go to some questions that are in the box, and I've written about this elsewhere. Black feminism and transnational feminism, where in the context of the US, transnational feminism almost always means writing by South Asian women. These are two traditions that are thought as wholly irreconcilable, right? Like US Black women do not do transnational feminism, and quote unquote transnational feminism is thought to have nothing to say about the conditions of US Black women. That is how academic feminism's racial politics are oriented in the context of the US. But both of those traditions, transnational feminism and Black feminism, are thought to emerge from the articulation of a grievance. And that grievance is thought to be the grievance of being excluded from feminist theory. It is remarkable to me that after decades of writing that complicates this narrative, and decades of feminists really, I think, being attentive to what Claire Hemmings calls the stories that we tell, this still remains the prevailing story that we tell, which is entirely to this question about how women of color is sort of presumed to be other and aggrieved other. So thanks for the question.
How are you doing, Jennifer? You must be getting exhausted. Are you okay with more and more?
Yeah, I've lost track of what time it is there. 7:54, right?
It's about 8. Yeah, it's going to be.
Can we go until
we're doing okay.
Great.
The labor is yours right now. So
let's do a few more questions.
Okay, we'll do a few more then. So we have Geeta Chadha asking, it's a longish, in the origin stories part, don't we as feminists desire that our concepts be named and not just be told that they always existed? We encounter this all the time in the wider academia. I get the point about not overemphasizing individuals associated with concepts and facilitating genealogies of the collective. But in the academia that privileges individual contributions, shouldn't we ask questions of the larger academic cultures rather than blame ourselves as feminist theorists? In fact, in the section on how the critic is constructed, once again, we see the individual is getting centered. You seem to be uncomfortable with the unnaming of the critic and also a discomfort of naming the individual critic. Is there a way out of this tension?
Thanks for that. I'll try to go through these one at a time because there are a number of great questions here. So Geeta, you mentioned, don't we as feminists desire that our concepts be named and not just be told that they already existed? Absolutely. I mean, I think that so much of what underpins this anxiety about origins is a desire to have labor and innovation marked, right? And this is Sirma Bilge about the whitening of intersectionality, right? When she says women's studies now wants to claim that intersectionality was always already there, but it wasn't. It was the result of labor. My desire with origin stories and naming them as such is actually to think about how the questions that are at the heart of intersectionality theory are questions that that a variety of scholars and activists have thought and rethought in different moments. And that actually, if we dispense of our preoccupation with locating a singular origin, and this goes to my previous comments, we can actually think about connections between traditions of feminist thought that are imagined as separate. So for example, when I teach this bridge called My Back and Ansel Dua and Moraga, I teach that alongside Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins as texts that are doing intersectional thinking. Even as Moraga and Ansel Dua are not using the term intersectionality at all, they want to think about mestizaje, they want to think about genre bending as a way of getting at experiences of multiple marginalization. If I'm wedded to origin stories, and if I'm wedded to origin stories that presume the location of intersectionality in Black women's thought, I cannot think about, it becomes impossible for me to think about the centrality of a text like this bridge called My Back to women of color feminist thought more broadly, right? I also cannot see connections between someone like critical legal studies scholar Mari Matsuda and Kimberly Crenshaw. It becomes impossible. And so I think the challenge is to strike a balance between acknowledging labor. And there is, like I said, there's real, people have put their bodies on the line in like a literal and material way to forge the fields that we are a part of, right? To name that and to not allow fields to take credit for work that has been forged in the bodies and blood of women of color, but to also not presume that the story that we need to tell is about a singular actor. I often tell this joke. I tell my students, people talk about Kimberly Crenshaw like she received the word and wrote it down, right? And like, how did we as feminists become so wedded to a moment where everything is about sort of originalism and her receiving wisdom and giving it to us, right? Like, there's this long tradition of scholars across the globe thinking about a set of questions that are intersectional. So that's part of your question. The second part of your question, uncomfortable with the unnaming of the critic and a discomfort of naming the individual critic. Is there a way out of this tension? My discomfort, I think, is actually about a Black feminist narrative that there are critics everywhere, right? The critic is out there. And as Vivian May says, that the primary way that intersectionality now circulates is through critique. I find that to be a really fascinating narrative. I also find it to be untrue. And that's why I point to Puar, and I found this desire to think about who is the critic. So as a Black feminist politic, I actually think naming names is quite important. And I think it's connected to your first question. which was really about the politics of citation. So in my own work, if I want to name what critics do or say, I name those critics, right? Like, here are the people who I'm talking about, which is a way of both acknowledging labor, but also being precise about what the field looks and feels like in a particular moment. I think that there's a way that Black feminists have too easily relied on this narrative of there are these bad guys out there who are attacking intersectionality. And by simply rehearsing the term the critic over and over and over again, we've hidden the fact that there actually isn't this huge chorus of people undermining the analytic. So that's sort of my response to that. So hopefully that gets to your question, Geeta. Thank you.
Okay, there's a comment from Swati Kamble who says, I call myself an intersectional feminist because it describes the complexities of my identities. That's, I think, more of a comment. And then we have Sandeep Rai, lovely presentation. Thanks so much. Please say a little on how would intersectionality view the social identity of a physically infirm female laborer in general and an agrarian farm woman labor in particular. Does intersectionality address the stigmatized image of the disabled female worker?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. I think, Sandeep, it's sort of, I think this again goes to how you conceptualize intersectionality. So, I mean, my own conception of intersectionality, as I mentioned before, is really trying to think through how systems and structures coincide, interlock, to produce conditions in and through which certain people, certain bodies, which in the context of the US are Black people by and large, are subjected to or vulnerable to myriad forms of violence, whether it's police violence, whether it's the violence of poverty and precarity, whether it's the violence of failing schools, the violence of no public transportation, right? Various forms of violence. Some of these forms of violence have become so normalized that we don't even identify them as violence. We simply identify them as the status quo. That's how I understand intersectionality. So I think what an intersectional analysis allows us to do is to think, for example, about how the conditions and embodied experiences of, as you say, the disabled female worker, or to think about how questions of disability shape capacity to work or not work, the experiences of work or non-work and the like. I will say, in the context of the US, there are certain categories that intersectionality has been less attuned to. One of those is disability. And I think thanks to a kind of growth in disability studies in the US in the last 10 to 15 years, that's starting to change. But historically, intersectionality has not been particularly attentive to disability. Another category that US based intersectionality theory has not been attentive to is religion, right? And some of this is because intersectionality in the US grows out of a relationship to a critique of law. And in the US, race and gender have a status, a protected status in relationship to law that religion and disability, and certainly class, do not. Class has it receives no protection vis-a-vis law. Religion and disability receive some protection, and race and gender receive more protection. So there's a kind of complicated way that certain categories have received more attention from feminists who are engaged in intersectional analysis than others. So thank you for that question.
There are more comments. Swati again says, yes, the idea of collective ownership is what makes me so interested and drawn to the concept. Soma says property ownership as technologies of patriarchy, so true. And then we have a question from Meena Gopal. I was intrigued by your throwback to the sex wars. Does it also imply that the divide between feminism and queer theory will continue, especially where there are efforts to queer feminism, while on the one hand, the suspicion continues of TERFs, the trans exclusionary radical feminists?
Yeah, thank you for that. Just one response to a comment before I get to this question, Swati. I would highly recommend Patricia Williams's book, The Alchemy of Race and Rights, on this question of collective ownership. I think you might find it really moving. Mina, your question about the sex wars, it's such a great question. I think the divide between feminism and queer theory, between feminist theory and queer theory, between feminist studies and queer studies, between gender studies and sexuality studies, that these are divides that continue to get played out in the context of academic feminism in different ways, in different moments. And so, I mean, like, one of the things that I've really come up against here in the last couple of years is my students proclaiming either queer theory or feminist theory or both to be dead, right? Like, it's over. And so, but they're dead for different reasons. So they're feminist theory and queer theory are always being treated as distant cousins or something, right? Like, there's a relation, but they're distant cousins, and there's always imagined to be tension or suspicion there. Even as I'm always assigning texts that suggest that you can't do one form of analysis without the other, right? Like, if we read Gail Rubin's Thinking Sex, even as she gives us that moment where she's like, maybe we need queer theory, but I'm like, she's doing queer analysis through feminism. When we read Lynn Huffer, she's thinking feminist theory and queer theory together. Evelyn Hemmons, I mean, so I think it's such a complicated question, and to me, the larger question there is, why has academic feminism sort of been propelled by this narrative of wars, right? Because I think it has been such a powerful narrative that we've been so attached to, that I think, other field, I'm not somebody who's been trained in conventional disciplines. I've only been trained in interdisciplinary fields. But when I see my colleagues and friends in sociology or anthropology, there are battles, sure, but there's not the kind of intensity of warfare that feminists have had around sex, sexuality, pleasure, queerness, gender, whether woman is an object that we should continue to be invested in, right? So I think there's a really fascinating psychoanalytic story to be told there about our attachment to warfare.
Thank you.
Mina, you want to add to that, Mina?
No, I'm good with this. Yeah, thank you. I think it's very refreshing to know this, and as you said, build connections, coalitions, and that's the way we need to take. So thank you for that. Thank you.
Manjusha Madhu is asking, I was hoping if you could reflect a little further on the idea of the outsider. You mentioned how you being considered as a Black feminist enables this understanding that your critique comes from a space of love and not one of hostility. What could be the political and theoretical consequences of interrogating the idea of the outsider, both for academic, disciplinary, or political practices?
Thanks, that's such a great question. On the level, on the first thinking of it as a theoretical question, or thinking about it in relationship to academic life, I think it's a question that is particularly challenging for those of us who work in interdisciplinary fields, right? Like, I think in sociology, who's not a sociologist by virtue of their methods, right? In anthropology, right, there's a way in which disciplines police the boundaries of disciplinary knowledge in certain ways around canons and methods and field formation. And there's a way in which the promise of interdisciplinarity has long been that we don't do that, right? It has long been that we're multi-method, that our canon is sort of an anti-canon in some ways, even as it is a canon, that we're not as invested in policing boundaries, or that we're capacious in our conception of what constitutes work on gender and sexuality. And yet, there has to be some coherence to our project. I mean, I was teaching Wendy Brown's The Impossibility of Women's Studies, which is an article from the 90s, where she's making the claim that I don't believe, but that I find really provocative, that academic feminism has become an incoherent project. And that when she and her colleagues sit down to try to figure out what constitutes an undergraduate curriculum in women's studies, they're at a loss about how to organize it. And I take some of that I take that quote unquote incoherence to be about anti-disciplinarity and a fundamental openness to what, as you call in your question, the outsider, that I find really generative. But I think the challenge is how do you ensure coherence? I think as a political question, this idea of who's an outsider becomes far more complicated, right? Because political movements are motivated by this idea that there is a constituency. And while that constituency doesn't need to be marked by sameness, this is the promise of coalitional politics, that there is a sense of shared need, right? or a sense of a shared conception of what a different or better world would be. And so I think the stakes become much higher. I think in the context of the US, again, to this appropriation word, we had a moment when everybody had a sign up that said Black Lives Matter, and everybody was wearing their BLM t-shirts and engaging in the same horrifying racist practices, but now while wearing a t-shirt that suggested solidarity with the movement for Black life, becomes a very complicated moment. And you're like, I really actually do want to have some sense of who's with me and who's not. I evoked Kathy Cohen's article earlier, and I'll just mention it again because I think these are questions that she's trying to think through. She's trying to think through a political movement where folks who are marginalized in a variety of ways see their shared but different marginality and organize around it. Joshua Chambers-Letson takes this up in his new book, After the Party, where he talks about what he calls minoritarian performance as a place that allows minoritarian folks who are minoritarian in different ways and who recognize the differences in their experiences of subordination to come together. That's a real challenge. So I think that becomes really hard political work. So thanks for the question.
I think everyone now is saying thank you, Bhashwati, Geeta, Swati, to your responses. I won't try and push you further. I mean, I'm half tempted to play the devil's advocate type of thing to say maybe there's a reason why Black feminists get defensive. Because we are in the game of gaining space in institutional spaces which are limited. It's all about territory. My few years in the US, I've seen it there. Even in the renaming question, women's studies, gender studies, sexuality studies, constantly the fear that someone else is taking over the little space that you have. My worry is more that we don't name the actual, we attack each other rather than attacking whatever you want to call it, capitalist heteropatriarchy, that is actually the one that is farming out the little bit of territory available to folks. And we end up policing each other rather than naming the larger struggles that we're up against. And the Indian context, of course, is very different. I'm sensing, though maybe I don't know if I'm right, but the names you have, your own writing and the kind of citation practice you've used, give one the feeling, and your own attitude as a productive critic, give one the sense that there is now considerable territory being occupied by Black feminist theorists or Black feminist scholarship. And therefore the old story shouldn't be retold over and over again. I'm not so sure that the same story can be told here, where the parallel is with caste, and where Dalit women have yet to gain a genuine, meaningful, significant foothold in academics. We've had a very late entry of through our own policies and so on, enabling entry, and it's in that sense more obviously, to my mind, compared to the situation in the US, a much more clearly marginal location. Whether it be Dalit scholarship in general, that is men included, or any gender, and women in particular. And yet it has occupied, I think you've sensed that maybe from some of the questions, there has been a special feeling of kinship, if you like, on the part of Dalit feminists towards intersectionality. And here too, one would pause to, is there a defensiveness there? How do we evaluate that? If there is, what are critics saying about that, and so on? I think these are questions for the future. I think these are, I think your approach makes for much more openness in taking risks in this field and looking for solidarities. But it is also a very, how shall I say, it's a very tense, I won't call them wars, but yes, we attack each other, and it's painful. And that's something, the question, what can intersectionality do different here, would be, in my view, a very, very interesting question to think about some more.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Mary, for that. I mean, I think to this point about space, it's so hard to narrate. Progress is not the right word, because anyone who is a student of movements on the left know that progress is a narrative that's sold to us, right? And so that's not the term that I want to use, but it is certainly the case that in the context of the US, it is certainly the case that in the context of the US, in the context of academic feminism, and in the context of a kind of post-2016 Trump's election, there is this sense of there's a rhetorical investment in Black women and Black feminist knowledge production. I think of it as a moment, and I think of it as a moment that will pass. And this is why the question of territory becomes so important. So, I mean, last year, as I said, was this moment where every institution was like, we have to think about race. And so there's been the commitment of a certain amount of resources at various institutions to thinking about race and hiring and starting initiatives. That is a window. I believe that window will close, right? And so my interest is in thinking about both the power that we, Black women and Black feminists, have in this moment, where we have attention and interest, and getting as many Black women into the university as I can in this moment, knowing that in another year, institutional interest and priorities will likely be different. So I think the question about space and what we carve out is fraught, and it's fraught for a reason for us. The last thing I'll say about defensiveness before we wrap up, because everybody, I know you all need to eat dinner, is that I try to diagnose defensiveness in my book, because I think it does something to us Black feminists, in addition to having us war with each other. I actually think it's an exhausting position. I think it's really tiring to spend so much time feeling like something's been taken from you. And I also think it means that there are ways of thinking and imagining that Black feminists have taken up that we have not yet, that we have not turned our attention to, because we spend so much time talking about, are you a Black feminist or not? Are you using intersectionality correctly or not? And so I'm interested in actually like freeing up the energy that we've put towards surveilling boundaries and using it in other ways. Not because I think there are plenty of good reasons for us to feel defensive, but I think it's an energy suck for us. And that's really my concern. So thank you for your comments, Mary, and thank you all for your amazing questions. I wish I could meet you in person, and I hold out hope that one day I will. So, thank you.
No, so on behalf of everyone, I don't know if you want to open your screens for a minute and just thank Jennifer for a truly marvelous talk and marvelous interaction with us all. Thank you. It has been very, very good to have you, and we must think of a time not too far away when we actually bring you here and actually have you spend time with us as it ought to have been, but couldn't for all the reasons that we know too well. So with that, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
And
Thank
bye.
you.
Yeah.